Let's learn about gathering. So when you're doing gathering, you're basically running a line of stitches along a piece of fabric, so then you can scrunch them up together. How this works is over at the sewing machine, you're going to set your stitch width to 0, your stitch length to the highest it can be on a straight stitch. The way that I like to do my gathering is you're going to make sure you have a nice long tail at the beginning, and then you're going to stitch all the way down. Now, depending on what your seam allowance is, you are going to stitch this first line of stitching slightly smaller than your seam allowance. So if my seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, I might sew this at 3/8 of an inch. And you're going to do that all the way down. Now, this part is very important, is I recommend you stop doing your gathering before you hit your seam allowance. So if your seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, stop your gathering 5/8 of an inch before you reach the end. From here, you're going to lift your presser foot, pivot it, and then sew 1 or 2 stitches down before pivoting it again. Now, those 1 or 2 stitches down is so that you can sew a second line of parallel stitches beside it, but now this second line you want to sew to the outside of your seam allowance. So this line was smaller than your seam allowance. The second line will now be bigger than your seam allowance. Once you get to the other end, I would still also stop before you reach the seam allowance part. Lift your presser foot, take it out, and give yourself a nice long tail. Now, the reason I stopped before I hit the seam allowance is because I'm assuming this piece of fabric is still going to get sewn into another piece of fabric after this, and if it's scrunched here at the seam allowance, then you can't really do that. Or at the very least, it makes it kind of tricky. Now, I am going to pick out either the top threads or the bottom threads. It does not matter which, you just have to be consistent. And I'm going to take both of these threads, and I'm going to start pulling, keep tension on these, while scrunching the fabric this way. And you'll see it is starting to gather the fabric. Now, by having one set of stitches inside the seam allowance and one set of stitches outside the seam allowance, it means I gather them evenly, both on the top and the bottom, so that the stitching line can be nice and consistent and neat. And the reason why I turned around at this end instead of cutting the thread is because by having this turn around, this little U-turn, it means I can't accidentally pull the stitches so much that I start pulling them out of the fabric on this end. I also have to make sure I only pull either the top or the bottom threads. I cannot start tugging at these bottom threads now, otherwise I will not be able to gather them properly, because what this has done is essentially stitches the bottom threads are, you see, catching on these top threads, and it makes a little channel for me to gather things through. If I start pulling on these bottom threads, it will then tighten that channel and make it so that nothing can be pulled through. And after I've gathered it to the size I need it to be, I can sew it onto my next piece of fabric and remove all of these gathering threads once I'm done. Hope this helped. Happy sewing!